I've got a time lapse of a small 7 by 10 inch transparent watercolor of an ovenbird to share. These are beautiful birds that I hear much more often than I see. They like skulking around in the leaf litter looking for insects to eat. I got photos of a fairly cooperative bird along the river trail here in Lansing and combined a few reference photos from that day into this painting. I did my sketches in a sketchbook and transferred those to the hot press watercolor block using tracing paper. A link to a video explaining that trick will be linked below. After that, I masked off the foreground elements using liquid Frisket. I wanted a soft, blurry green background, so I pre-saturated my paper with water, making sure it was evenly soaked. My main background had 3 pre-mixed, partially desaturated greens. I used phthalo green with some yellow ochre and chrome orange for the lightest colors, and then moved to phthalo green and ultramarine blue with some yellow ochre and cadmium red medium to knock it back a bit. I did a wet-on-wet wash in the background, keeping my darkest pigments toward the bottom of the page where they might get darker if they puddle. I wicked off any extra pigment to avoid back runs in the even wash. While the page was still wet, I used a number 2 brush to put in some suggestions of blurry branches and ground cover. I hit those with the hairdryer to lock in the colors. Then I suggested some mid-ground greenery without a lot of information, loosely brushing in some textures in a few passes and hitting that with the hairdryer here and there as I went. I was hoping to vignette the bird so the background was fairly even and plain behind it. Hopefully this will lend to a placid look to the painting and frame up the action nicely. I added some quick suggestions of shadows to add some depth to the middle ground foliage. Once I was happy with the background, I removed the Frisket. I'll add in more details to the middle ground elements later to blend them gradually with the background. After removal, I discovered there was a small gap in the Frisket, so the wash went into the bird's neck. I gave that a light scrub with water and blotted it off. It should disappear in the final painting. Despite best efforts, accidents do happen along the way. Learning to repair little problems like this is a valuable skill. With the background mostly finished, I transferred the rest of the sketch using tracing paper and a folding bone. My goal now was to cover the white of the page with the lightest local colors. One of the first things I did was to quickly wash in some shadows over the whole foreground using ultramarine blue and dioxazine purple. Putting those shadows in early should help unify the colors and make sure the overall scene has consistent lighting. Then I started adding in my greens. I ended up using many of my greens from the wash well plate to grab colors from. I also mixed in more saturated greens using phthalo green and lemon yellow. The more saturated colors on the leaves should help separate the foreground from the less saturated background. I always try to work over the entire page so nothing gets ignored for too long. My teachers in art schools always said, work the whole canvas, everything's important. And I definitely agree. Working the whole page develops detail consistently, and moving about also helps you be conscientious of your color harmonies. In this painting, I wanted to keep the foreground leaves and the soil more out of focus with much less detail and not completely painted in. This should help lead the eye into the painting and focus your attention on the bird. Leaf litter and dirt aren't typically the most interesting subjects, so I didn't want to draw a lot of attention to that area. I did need it to be detailed enough to read correctly and have a sense of depth. I chose to amp up the colors in this area a lot compared to my reference, including some fairly saturated shadows to add interest without a lot of detail. For this painting, it was mostly green and brown colors. A limited palette can help unify a painting. In this case, I tried to keep my background in general less saturated, with the bulk of the contrast and the saturation being in the foreground colors. When rendering that foreground leaf litter, I chose to bring in a lot of warm browns, yellows, and oranges because those colors are dominant in the olives and oranges on the bird. I used some glazes of orange in the foreground leaves with the same logic. My photo reference wasn't great. I've never gotten many good shots of ovenbirds. Typically, they get at least partially obscured by all the low foliage they like hunting in. This was no exception. The bird in my main photo was blurry, but it had some interesting things happening. At least I thought they were worthy of investigation. I liked the overall scene with a low depth of field and the blurred out background. I chose to make the scene a little less backlit than the reference, and I used an ovenbird from other photos that I took. These all suffered from the blurry foreground elements obscuring the bird. For the olive colors on the ovenbird, I used chrome orange, yellow ochre, and some of my same desaturated greens for my background. The bird's feet were rose madder and dioxazine purple with some ultramarine blue in the shadows. Shading on the ovenbird's belly was ultramarine blue, phthalo blue, and dioxazine purple. Dark feathers, those were mixes of phthalo green, permanent alizarin crimson, and dioxazine purple. When designing the painting, I chose to amp up the archway look of the foreground plants, adding in some more swooping plants to add to the concentric framing of the ovenbird. Choosing an arch stick as a perch was done for similar reasons. Hopefully those repeated forms will add more visual interest and provide some fun motion to the painting. Most of the painting was completed using a number 2 round brush. These brushes tend to last for only 4 or 5 paintings if I'm doing a 7x10 inch work before they start getting dull. Number 2 brushes especially wear out from the billion brush strokes used to render long, fine details and textures of fur, leaves, and bark. There must be more friction from the paper on the hair fibers than you'd think. I've been using these gray-handled number 2 Mimic brushes from Jerry's Artorama for about 7 years now. They seem to be the best compromise brush. They call them synthetic squirrel. I'm not sure why, other than the fact that they have black synthetic hairs. While real squirrel brushes hold a lot of pigment or water, I've found those to be pretty floppy and I don't much care for them. Red sable brushes hold a lot of paint and they have perfect spring and they are great in every way except 2 things. They're expensive and who wants to hurt a cute little sable? I've used red sable brushes in the past and they are the standard to compare with. At the rate I wear them out, I can't justify them when they're only a bit better than the relatively cheap Mimic brushes. Plus, it's hard for me to rationalize painting all these great animals while killing off a super cute sable to make the paintings. The more I thought about it, the less I wanted to use the sable brushes and switched over to the synthetics. Late in the painting, I was adding a lot of detail with darks using a 10-aught brush, and I'm often just sharpening up little edges that I need to be crisp. After a while, I run out of small edits that I need to make with the painting, and I call it finished. So there you go. This was a 7x10 inch transparent watercolor of an ovenbird. Thanks for watching.